Welcome back to 24 Billion Stories. We're kicking off a series today that I'm calling Campfire Stories. My favorite place in the world to tell stories is around a campfire. But we're in Cleveland and it's January. Not exactly conducive to having campfires or sitting around them and telling stories. So we're going to have to settle for telling stories in front of a fireplace, which I think is a really great second choice. We're kicking this series off today with one of my favorite stories, The Shoemaker and the King. I'm going to tell you all about it right after this. The Shoemaker and the King is actually based on a folk tale, and it can be found in a lot of different countries, Israel, Greece, Germany, and many others. I first read the story in a wonderful little book called Stories for Telling by William R. White. It's a great little collection of stories that are great for telling. There's not a lot of detail in them. It leaves a lot of room for embellishment and creativity. One of my favorite books in the history of books. You can find it on Amazon.com. I included the link below in case you would like to get a copy for yourself. But without any further ado, here is The Shoemaker and the King. Once upon a time, there was a king. And this king was a good king. He loved his kingdom. And he found that it was very important as king to not lose touch with how ordinary people felt and thought and acted, what they believed, what they experienced, and how they lived their lives. He also knew that wherever he went as the king, people treated him differently, and it was hard to really get a sense of what their lives were really like and who they really were. So this king developed a rather unusual practice. He would periodically, at least once a month, dress as a commoner and move among the streets and villages and cities and towns of his kingdom to get to know what life was like from the perspective of the ordinary people. Well, one evening he was doing this, and it wasn't a really very pleasant evening. It was kind of cold, and it was kind of rainy, and there weren't a lot of people out, and the king was about to chalk up this visit into his kingdom as a total loss when he turned a corner and saw light pouring from an open door halfway down this cobblestone street. He walked up to the open door and he knocked on the frame, and he saw inside a big burly man who was cooking some stew over a pot over his fire. And the king said to him, "Hello, friend. Might you have a meal for a weary traveler?" And the man turned around and said, "My friend, welcome." Of course, he'd never seen them before, but this man, everyone he met was his friend. "My friend, welcome. Welcome to my humble home. Of course I have some food to share with a weary traveler. Please come in, take off that wet jacket, hang it by the fire so it can dry. Have a seat. Here, drink a little while the stew finishes." And the man continued to stir the stew, and he continued to talk with his friend. And the king asked him, Sir, who are you? What do you do?" And the man said, "Ah, my friend, I'm but a humble shoemaker. I spend my days making shoes and walking around the streets of this fair city. I take some shoes with me and my tools, and those who don't have shoes, I sell them shoes, and those who have shoes but need them repaired, I repair them. They pay me a little money. At the end of the day, I stop at the market. I buy my food for the evening. If I have any money left over, I give it to the poor. Then I come back here and enjoy my meal." Well, the king was stunned by this revelation. And he said as much to the man, "Sir, how can you do that? If you give away and spend all of your money, what will you do if you can't earn money the next day? This doesn't seem very wise to me. You're not planning for the future. What about tomorrow?" And the shoemaker looked at the king and he said, "My friend, eat your stew, enjoy it, for tomorrow is in the hands of God, and I will praise him day by day." Well, the king went home that night with a belly full of a very tasty stew, but he wanted to teach his new friend a lesson because he felt this man was being naive and foolish. So the king issued a proclamation that made it illegal for anyone to make or repair shoes for another person. That evening, he dressed again in his commoner's clothes and went back to see how his shoemaker friend was faring and if he had learned his lesson. When he approached the house, he was convinced he would find the shoemaker sad and in a terrible state. But instead, once again, the door was open, light was streaming from the door, and he could hear the shoemaker singing tonight. He looked inside the door, and there was his friend, cooking a pot of stew over the fire. And the king knocked on the door frame and said, "Dear friend, might I join you for another meal?" And The shoemaker said, "Welcome, of course, come in, there's plenty, come, have a seat, take off your jacket, enjoy a meal." The king said, "My friend, I must say I was concerned about you today. When I heard our king's proclamation, I feared that you would have nothing to eat tonight." The shoemaker laughed. "Ah, I too learned of our good, wise king's proclamation. When I learned that I couldn't repair shoes or make shoes for anyone else, I took my buckets and I went to the well, and I spent the day carrying water for folks who could not carry it for themselves. At the end of the day, they gave me a little money. I stopped at the market. I bought the food that you see before us tonight, and what money I had left over I gave to the poor." Well, the king was dumbfounded. He scratched his head. "Dear friend," he said, "how can you do this? What if the law changes again? What if you can't carry water? What will you do? You are not planning for tomorrow. You should be planning for tomorrow." But the shoemaker just clapped his friend on the shoulder and laughed. "My friend, tomorrow is in the hands of God, and I will praise him day by day." Well, that evening the king was determined that he really needed to teach this man a lesson. So he issued a new proclamation that was announced at the crack of dawn the following morning. No one now may carry water for another person. That evening he went back to the shoemaker's house, once again expecting to find him in a sad and sorry state. When he arrived there, though, once again the door was open, light was streaming from the house, and music, the song of the shoemaker, was pouring from the door and the windows. The king knocked on the door. The shoemaker turned, and before the king could say anything, the shoemaker said, "My friend, welcome, welcome. Will you join me for dinner this evening?" And the king said, "For dinner? I'm surprised you have any food to eat." "How can you have food to eat? I heard our king's proclamation. Most unfair, it seemed to me, that no one may haul water for another." And the shoemaker said, "Ah, I too heard our good king's proclamation, and when I learned that I couldn't haul water for another, I simply got my axe, walked into the forest, and spent the day chopping wood for those who could not chop firewood for themselves. I carried it back in. I sold it for a little money. I used that money to buy the food you see before us tonight, and what money I had left over, I gave to the poor." The king was dismayed. He said, "My friend, what will you do? What will you do if you cannot chop wood tomorrow? What will you do then? You need to plan for tomorrow." The shoemaker just shook his head, and he said quieter this time, concerned for his new friend, "My friend, tomorrow is in the hands of God. I will praise him day by day." Well, the king was wise, and he knew desperate times called for desperate measures, and this indeed was a desperate situation. He needed to teach this man a lesson about preparing for the future, about preparing for tomorrow. And so that night, the king issued a new proclamation, and the next morning, soldiers arrived at the shoemaker's house before he could leave and announced to him that he had been drafted into the king's army. Well, he went to the grounds where the king's recruits trained. He spent the entire day from morning until night training, learning different skills. He received nothing the entire day, no payment, none at all, except a battered old sword that he was to bring back for the next day for more training. Well, that night, the king went back to the shoemaker's house once again, expecting to find him in a sorry state. In fact, he went prepared this time. He brought some food of his own to share with the shoemaker, knowing that he would have none to eat that evening. But when he arrived, the king was dumbfounded. The door was open, bright light was pouring forth, and the voice of the shoemaker singing poured from the house. The king saw him standing over a pot of stew, cooking. And the king said, "My friend, how can you have food? I heard that you had been drafted into the king's army. You spent the entire day training. Did the king pay you well? I hope he paid you well." The shoemaker said, "Alas, I was drafted into our good king's army, and alas, I did spend the entire day training, though the work of a soldier is not truly suited to me. And alas, he did not pay me well. He did not pay me at all, but our king is a good king and a wise king. He did give me a sword to use for my training. So on the way home, I removed the blade from the sword, and I sold the metal for scrap. I used that money to buy food for the evening, to buy a stick of good solid wood, and then I gave the money I had left over to the poor. I've come home, and I've prepared this dinner hoping that you would join me." And the king looked at it. This time he was truly shocked. His eyes were wide, and he looked very scared. "My friend, that sword, they will expect you to have that tomorrow. If you don't have it, you may be arrested for stealing. This is very bad, my friend. How could you do such a thing?" "Ah, my friend, it is no cause to be alarmed. I told you I bought a stick of very solid wood. I will spend the evening carving a wooden blade for the sword." And the king just shook his head. "A wooden blade! Anyone who sees the wooden blade will know it's a wooden blade. You will fool no one with this. You will be in deep trouble tomorrow, my friend." But the shoemaker held up his hand, and he looked seriously at the king, and he said, "My friend, tomorrow is in the hands of God. I will praise him day by day." The king shared a very tasty meal, and he went home deeply concerned about his friend. Still determined to teach him a lesson, he spoke to the sergeant-at-arms in his army and gave him special instructions for the shoemaker when he arrived. And so the next morning, when the shoemaker arrived at dawn for his training, the sergeant-at-arms pulled him aside, and he said, You, sir, you have been chosen today to hand out punishment for a convicted criminal. He has done a horrible thing, and his sentence is death by beheading. You will use your sword to chop off this man's head." At this, the shoemaker did look alarmed, and he said to the sergeant-at-arms, But sir, I'm just a humble shoemaker by trade. I am not a soldier. I am not a killer. My king has drafted me into his army, so I will serve. But please, is there no other that can do this task?" The sergeant-at-arms said, "No, you have been selected. You will execute him at noon." At noontime, in the square in front of the castle, all of the soldiers were gathered. The criminal was placed upon his knees and his head placed down upon the chopping block. And the sergeant-at-arms read his crime and read the sentence, that it was to be death. And he looked at the shoemaker and said, "Soldier, draw your sword and strike off this man's head." The king was standing back in the crowd watching. The shoemaker looked worried, and the king was pleased. The shoemaker walked up to the man who was convicted of death. He looked down at him. He looked up again once more at the sergeant-at-arms, pleading in his eyes, but the sergeant-at-arms only glared at him. And then the shoemaker, he placed one hand on the hilt of his wooden sword, and he lifted his other hand to heaven, and he prayed. And he prayed like this: "Dear God, you are all wise and you are all knowing. You are full of grace and you are full of truth. You are full of justice and you are full of mercy. If it is just and right that this man should die for his crimes, then may my sword be sharp and my arm be strong. But if you wish to show mercy to this man, then may my sword be made of wood." The shoemaker lowered his hand, opened his eyes, and with a flourish drew his sword, and lo and behold, it was made of wood. The sergeant-at-arms gasped. The soldiers gasped. Some of them cried out. The prisoner wept in relief. God had performed a miracle and saved his life. At this point, the king pressed through the crowd and walked up to the shoemaker. He cast off his commoner's clothes and stood there in the regalia of the king. The shoemaker looked at him dumbfounded and surprised. He had no idea that his nightly visitor had been the king. He knelt before the king to pay him homage, but the king lifted him to his feet, and he said, "My friend, you are indeed wise. Your wisdom exceeds my own. From this day forward, you will no longer be a soldier. You will no longer be a shoemaker. You will serve as my counselor to offer your wisdom and service to the whole kingdom. What do you say to that, my friend?" Well, the shoemaker looked at the king and he smiled. He embraced him and said in a loud voice, "Tomorrow is in the hands of God, and I will praise him day by day." And that is the story of the shoemaker and the king. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, let me know about it in the comments. If you didn't, let me know that in the comments too. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again real soon. Until then, keep listening to stories and keep telling yours.